Bruce Lee was sitting alone on a weathered wooden bench in MacArthur Park, Los Angeles, on a humid September afternoon in 1964. The air hung thick and heavy, carrying the smell of cut grass and exhaust fumes from the nearby freeway. 23 years old, 5 feet 7 inches, 135 pounds. He wore a plain white t-shirt that clung to his frame, dark slacks, and canvas shoes. Nothing that would draw attention. His hands rested on his knees, fingers relaxed, eyes half closed as he breathed slowly, methodically, finding stillness in the chaos of the city around him. This was before the fame, before the films that would make his name synonymous with martial arts, before millions would study his philosophy and imitate his movements. This was Bruce Lee the teacher, the unknown immigrant trying to build something meaningful in a country that saw him as foreign, as less than. He came to the park most afternoons when he could, seeking moments of mental clarity between teaching students at his small school and working odd jobs to keep the lights on. The park was alive with ordinary afternoon chaos. Children shrieked on the playground equipment, their laughter cutting through the drone of traffic. A group of elderly men played chess at concrete tables under the shade of aging oak trees. Young mothers pushed strollers along the winding paths, their conversations blending into the ambient noise of urban life. Pigeons congregated near a hot dog vendor, pecking at fallen crumbs with mechanical persistence. Bruce noticed everything without seeming to notice anything. This was his practice: to remain aware while appearing at rest, to observe without judgment, to exist fully in each moment. His instructor, Yip Man, had taught him that true mastery begins with stillness, with the ability to remain calm when chaos erupts around you. So he sat, breathing, observing, present. What none of the people in that park understood, what they couldn't have known just by looking at this lean, quiet young man on a bench, was that they were in the presence of someone who had spent nearly every day of his life since age 13 refining his body into something extraordinary. Bruce Lee had trained under some of the greatest Wing Chun masters in Hong Kong. He had studied boxing, fencing, and every fighting system he could find, taking what was useful and discarding what was not. He moved with a precision and speed that defied conventional understanding of human capability. But none of that showed when he sat still. Across the park, near the public restrooms, a woman walked alone. She was in her late 50s, dressed in a modest floral dress and practical shoes, carrying a brown leather purse tucked under her arm. Her name was Margaret Chen, a seamstress who worked in a factory downtown and stopped at this park twice a week to feed the ducks on her way home from her shift. She moved with the tired but purposeful gait of someone who had worked with her hands her entire life, someone whose back ached but who wouldn't complain, who simply kept moving because that's what life required. She didn't notice the man following her. He was perhaps 30 years old, over 6 feet tall, with the build of someone who had done hard labor. Broad shoulders, thick arms, a heaviness in his movements that spoke of both strength and aggression. He wore a stained white tank top and jeans with holes at the knees. His eyes tracked Margaret with predatory focus as she moved away from the crowded areas of the park toward the more secluded path near the lake. Bruce's eyes opened fully. The shift in his attention was subtle but complete. His breathing remained unchanged, calm, measured, but his awareness sharpened to a point. He watched as the large man closed the distance behind Margaret, watched the way he glanced around to see if anyone was paying attention, watched the moment of decision crystallize in the man's body language as he committed to whatever he was about to do. Margaret stopped to adjust her purse strap, and the man moved. It happened with brutal speed. He grabbed her from behind, one thick arm wrapping around her shoulder, the other hand yanking at her purse. Margaret's scream split the air, a sound of pure terror that seemed to freeze everything around it for a heartbeat. "Give it to me!" His voice was rough, edged with desperation and chemical volatility. "Don't fight, just give it." Margaret held on. Whether from instinct, stubbornness, or simply shock, she clutched the purse tighter. The man jerked harder, lifting her partially off the ground. She was tiny compared to him, maybe 5 feet 2, perhaps 90 pounds, and he shook her like she weighed nothing. "Help!" Her voice cracked, raw with fear. "Someone help me!" People noticed. Heads turned. A few people stood from the chess tables. The young mothers grabbed their children and stepped back. Everyone saw. No one moved. There is a phenomenon in crowds where everyone assumes someone else will act, where the presence of witnesses somehow paralyzes action rather than encouraging it. Dozens of people watched, frozen, as this woman was violently robbed in broad daylight. Bruce Lee stood from the bench. He didn't run. He moved quickly but with control, his body flowing across the grass with an economy of motion that made the distance seem shorter than it was. 50 yards, 40, 30? He closed the gap in seconds while the mugger was still focused on ripping the purse from Margaret's grip. 20 yards. The mugger finally sensed him. He turned, still gripping Margaret with one arm, and saw this lean Asian kid coming toward him. His expression shifted through confusion to dismissal in less than a second. This was Los Angeles in 1964, where men like Bruce Lee were regularly underestimated, regularly dismissed as weak, as insignificant, as not worth consideration. "Back off, boy." "The how?" Words came out in a snarl. "This ain't your business." Bruce didn't slow down, didn't speak. His eyes remained locked on the man's center mass, tracking every shift in weight, every micro-adjustment of position. 10 yards. The mugger made a decision. He shoved Margaret violently to the ground. She hit the pavement with a cry of pain and turned fully to face Bruce, his body coiling into an aggressive stance. His hands came up, fists clenched, shoulders rolling forward. He had maybe 70 pounds and 5 inches on Bruce. He was used to intimidating people with his size. "I said back off. You want some of this?" Bruce stopped. 3 yards between them now. Close enough to feel the man's presence, close enough to smell the sour sweat and alcohol coming off him. Close enough that everyone watching could see the size difference, could see what looked like a catastrophic mismatch. The mugger grinned, a dark, humorless expression. "That's what I thought. Little punk." He threw the first punch. It was a big, looping right hand, the kind of punch that carries all the weight of a large body behind it, the kind that could break bones if it connected. Fast for his size, committed, violent. It hit nothing but air. Bruce's body shifted, barely a movement at all, just the minimum necessary adjustment, and the fist sailed past his face by inches. In that same instant, before the man could reset, Bruce's lead hand flicked out. Not a punch, more like a touch. His fingertips struck the man's exposed throat with surgical precision, just enough pressure to trigger the body's panic response without causing permanent damage. The mugger's eyes went wide. His hands flew to his throat. The aggression drained from his face, replaced by confusion and the sudden primal terror of not being able to breathe properly. 1 second. Bruce's rear foot pivoted. His body rotated. His other hand came up in a tight arc, what would later be called a 1-inch punch, though no one in that park knew the name yet. His fist connected with the man's solar plexus, striking the nerve cluster just below the sternum with exactly calibrated force. The air exploded from the mugger's lungs. His body folded forward, all that mass suddenly robbed of structural support. His knees buckled. 2 seconds. Bruce's hands moved again, no wasted motion, no unnecessary strikes. He controlled the man's descent with one hand behind his neck, guiding him down rather than letting him crash. The mugger collapsed to his knees, then onto his side, gasping, completely incapacitated, but not seriously injured. 3 seconds. Silence descended on MacArthur Park like a physical weight. Bruce stood over the fallen man, breathing normally, his expression unchanged. He wasn't flexing, wasn't posturing, wasn't celebrating. He simply remained present, aware, making sure the threat was neutralized. The mugger curled into a fetal position on the ground, hands still at his throat, making wet choking sounds as he struggled to pull air into his paralyzed diaphragm. The crowd that had been frozen in fear now stood frozen in disbelief. A chess player with trembling hands looked at his watch, as if he could somehow measure what had just happened. It was 3 seconds, maybe less. Bruce turned away from the mugger and moved to Margaret Chen. She sat on the pavement where she'd fallen, her purse still clutched against her chest, her face streaked with tears. He knelt beside her, not hovering, not crowding, just close enough to offer presence and help if she wanted it. "Are you hurt?" His voice was soft, careful, stripped of any aggression or intensity, just concern, just a human question. Margaret stared at him. Her mouth opened, but no words came out at first. She looked at the man on the ground, then back at Bruce, trying to reconcile what she'd witnessed with what seemed physically possible. I. I don't. She touched her elbow where she'd hit the ground. I think I'm okay. I just. What did you. You're safe now. Bruce extended his hand, palm up, offering but not insisting. Let me help you up. She took his hand. He lifted her to her feet with gentle care, his other hand steadying her elbow. She swayed slightly, shock beginning to set in now that the immediate danger had passed. By now, others were moving. The young mothers came forward, creating a supportive circle around Margaret. One of the chess players had run to a nearby phone booth to call the police. A small crowd gathered around the mugger, who was beginning to breathe more regularly but still couldn't stand. People kept a wary distance, as if he might suddenly become dangerous again, though he clearly wasn't in any condition to threaten anyone. An elderly man in suspenders and a fedora approached Bruce. His eyes were wide with something between amazement and fear. Son, I've never seen anything like that in my life. What the hell kind of fighting was that? Bruce shook his head slightly. Just what was necessary, nothing more. Necessary? The man laughed, a shocked, slightly hysterical sound. You dropped that guy like he was made of paper. He had to have 70, 80 pounds on you. I thought he was going to kill you when he turned around. Size doesn't matter as much as people think. Bruce's voice remained calm, almost quiet. Speed, precision, understanding how the body works, these things matter more than mass. The crowd pressed closer, questions flying from multiple directions. How did you learn to fight like that? Where are you from? Do you teach? Can you do that again? The attention made Bruce visibly uncomfortable. He took a small step back, creating space, his body language closing off slightly. I don't fight to entertain. His words were gentle but firm. I did what needed to be done to protect someone who couldn't protect herself, that's all. Margaret Chen, steadier now with two women supporting her arms, looked at Bruce with an expression that mixed gratitude with something deeper, a kind of wondering respect. You saved me. That man would have. I don't know what he would have done. Bruce met her eyes. You held on, you called for help, you didn't give up. That matters. But no one was coming. Her voice cracked. Everyone just watched. I know. Bruce's expression softened with something like sadness. People are afraid. It's easier to watch than to act. Fear is natural, but we have to be more than our fear. A police siren wailed in the distance, growing louder. The mugger had managed to sit up, his back against a tree, his face ashen. He wasn't looking at anyone, just staring at the ground between his knees, his breath still coming in ragged gasps. Bruce glanced at him once, assessing, confirming he wasn't going to become a threat again. A young man in a UCLA sweatshirt pushed to the front of the crowd. I saw the whole thing, man, from right over there. I've never seen anyone move that fast. Are you like a boxer or something? I study martial arts. Bruce's answer was simple, not an invitation to elaborate. Which one? Karate? Judo? I study what works. I teach what I've learned, that's all. The police arrived in two squad cars, officers emerging with hands on their weapons, trying to assess the situation. The crowd erupted in competing explanations, everyone trying to talk at once. The police took immediate control, separating witnesses, checking on Margaret, handcuffing the mugger despite his protests that he couldn't breathe properly. An officer approached Bruce, notepad out. You the one who intervened? Yes, sir. Name? Bruce Lee. The officer wrote it down without reaction. Witnesses say you struck the suspect. Is that accurate? I defended Mrs. Chen. The man was attacking her. I used the minimum force necessary to stop the attack without causing permanent injury. Bruce's words were precise, measured, the language of someone who understood he was giving testimony that might matter later. You have training? Yes, sir. Martial arts instructor. The officer looked Bruce up and down, clearly trying to reconcile the quiet young man in front of him with the descriptions witnesses were giving of the takedown. People are saying you dropped him in seconds, 3 seconds, one guy said. I don't know the exact time. It happened quickly, I just reacted. Another officer was helping Margaret into one of the squad cars to take her statement. She looked back at Bruce before ducking inside. her expression still stunned. One of the chess players was animatedly reenacting what happened to a cluster of officers, his hands chopping through the air in approximations of Bruce's movements. The whole scene had the quality of unreality. People kept approaching Bruce, wanting to touch him, to thank him, to ask him questions. He answered when he could, politely but briefly, his discomfort with the attention becoming more obvious. This wasn't why he'd acted. He hadn't done it for recognition or praise. He'd done it because it was right, because someone needed help, because he had the ability to stop something terrible from happening. The officer interviewing Bruce finally closed his notepad. "We'll need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. Probably sometime this week. You live locally?" "I have a school in Oakland, but I'm in LA frequently. I can come whenever you need me." "We'll be in touch." The officer hesitated, then added, "Hell of a thing you did. Most people just watch. You probably saved that woman's life." Bruce didn't respond. There was nothing to say to that. He'd done what he'd done. The outcome was the outcome. Praise felt strange, misplaced, as if the act itself should be its own justification. As the police loaded the mugger into the back of a squad car, the man finally looked at Bruce. Their eyes met for just a moment. The mugger's expression was complex. Pain, confusion, and something that might have been grudging respect or might have been fear. He didn't say anything. Neither did Bruce. Then the door closed and the car pulled away. The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, as if leaving the scene would somehow diminish what they'd witnessed. People kept glancing back at Bruce, who had returned to his bench, sitting in the same position as before. Hands on knees, breathing slowly, eyes half closed. But something had changed. 3 people approached him over the next hour. One was a young black man who asked if Bruce was taking students. Another was a white businessman who wanted to hire him as a bodyguard. The third was a teenage girl who simply wanted to shake his hand and thank him for showing that size didn't determine strength. Bruce answered them all with the same patient courtesy. Yes, he taught, though his school was small. No, he wasn't interested in bodyguard work. And to the teenager, he said something that would stick with her for the rest of her life. Strength isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about knowing when to act and when to wait. It's about protecting others even when it's easier to look away. Word spread quickly through Los Angeles' martial arts community. By the next day, people were talking about the Chinese instructor who dropped a mugger in MacArthur Park in 3 seconds flat. By the end of the week, attendance at Bruce's small school in Oakland had doubled. Students who'd been skeptical of his methods, who thought his philosophy of using no way as way was too abstract, too unconventional, suddenly understood in a visceral way that what he taught was devastatingly effective. But the real impact went deeper than enrollment numbers. Margaret Chen recovered from her physical injuries within days. The psychological impact took longer, but she processed it with a resilience born from decades of hard work and perseverance. 2 weeks after the attack, she found out where Bruce taught and made the trip to Oakland. She brought him a suit jacket she'd made herself. Perfectly tailored, beautiful workmanship. The kind of gift that represented real skill and hours of labor. "I can't afford to pay you what you're worth," she told him, her eyes wet. "But I can do this. I can make beautiful things. So I made this for you." Bruce accepted the jacket with genuine gratitude. He wore it in photographs for years afterward. But more importantly, he asked Margaret to tell him her story. Where she'd come from. What her life had been like. What struggles she'd faced as a Chinese immigrant in America. He listened. Really listened. And something crystallized in his thinking. This is what would later drive him to challenge the martial arts establishment, to insist that fighting techniques should be effective for real people in real situations, not just impressive in demonstrations. This is what would push him to teach students regardless of their race or ethnicity, breaking the traditional barriers that kept martial arts siloed within ethnic communities. This is what would fuel his philosophy that martial arts should be a tool for genuine self-improvement and protection, not a way to dominate others or feed ego. 3 seconds in a park became the foundation for a legacy that would outlive Bruce Lee by decades. Years later, after his death in 1973, Margaret Chen would tell reporters about that day. By then, Bruce Lee was an international icon. Movies theaters around the world showed his films. Millions of people studied martial arts because of his influence. He'd become larger than life, a symbol of strength, discipline, and cultural pride. But Margaret remembered him as the quiet young man who had acted when everyone else froze, who had used exactly enough force to stop a threat without destroying the person threatening her, who had knelt beside her afterward with genuine concern in his eyes. He could have killed that man, she said in an interview in 1985. I've talked to martial artists over the years. They've explained to me what Bruce Lee was capable of, and they all say the same thing. He could have done permanent damage with those strikes, but he didn't. He stopped the attack. He protected me. And he didn't punish the man beyond what was necessary to keep us safe. That's the part people forget. Bruce Lee was famous for his speed and power, but what made him truly special was his restraint, his wisdom, his compassion. The mugger, whose name was Michael Torres, spent 18 months in prison for robbery and assault. When he got out, he did something unexpected. He tracked down one of Bruce Lee's former students and asked if he could train. Not to become a fighter, not to learn how to hurt people more effectively, but because, as he later explained, I need to understand what happened to me that day. I need to understand how someone can be that powerful and that controlled at the same time. I've spent my whole life using my size to intimidate people, to take what I want. And this guy who weighed nothing compared to me dropped me in 3 seconds and didn't even break a sweat. I need to learn what real strength is. He studied for 5 years, never became a master, never competed or taught. But he changed. His instructor said Michael became one of the most disciplined students he'd ever taught. Not the most talented, but the most committed to personal transformation. Michael eventually became a youth counselor, working with at-risk teenagers, and he would tell them about the day in MacArthur Park when a man he'd dismissed as weak taught him what true strength looked like. But here's what really matters, what this story is actually about. How many people were in that park that day? Dozens, maybe 100. All of them saw Margaret being attacked. All of them heard her scream for help, and how many acted? One. Not the biggest person there, not the loudest or the most obvious, just someone who had trained himself to respond instead of freeze, who had cultivated the ability to act decisively when action was required. Now, let me ask you something. Who in your life is Margaret Chen? Who is being attacked, maybe not physically, but attacked nonetheless, while people watch and do nothing? Who faces prejudice, discrimination, violence, or injustice while crowds of witnesses convince themselves it's not their problem, not their business, not their place to intervene? And more importantly, which person are you in this story? Are you Bruce Lee? The one who stands up, who acts, who uses whatever skills and strength you have to protect those who can't protect themselves? Or are you the crowd, the one who watches, who tells yourself someone else will handle it, who feels bad about what's happening but doesn't actually do anything to stop it? Because here's the uncomfortable truth, most of us are the crowd most of the time. We see injustice and we look away. We witness cruelty and we rationalize why it's not our responsibility. We convince ourselves that we're not equipped to help, that someone more qualified will step in, that getting involved might make things worse. Bruce Lee didn't have any special advantages that day beyond his training. He was smaller than the attacker. He was one person against someone bigger and more violent. He could have gotten hurt. He could have failed. But he acted anyway because someone needed help and he had the ability to provide it. That's what made him legendary. Not the speed of his hands or the power of his strikes. Those were just tools. What made him remarkable was his willingness to be the one person in a crowd of witnesses who refused to be a bystander. 3 seconds changed Margaret Chen's life. 3 seconds changed Michael Torres's life. And those 3 seconds rippled outward, influencing thousands of students, millions of martial